All right, I think we'll get started. All right, hi everyone. Thanks for tuning in to our IJNET webinar on journalist mental health. We began planning this webinar a couple months ago, and we had no idea how well timed it would be. We're all now facing challenges with a global health crisis. I'm Taylor Mulcahy. I'm the editor of IJNET. So I'm going to introduce our guests in just a minute, but I'm just going to give a quick rundown of logistics here as we start the webinar. We've collected a number of questions from people ahead of time, and those have all been incorporated into our discussion. But you're still welcome to submit questions in a few ways while you're watching live. You can do so through the chat function at the bottom of Zoom. If you're watching on Facebook Live, you can submit your questions in the comments. And we are also taking questions on Twitter using the hashtag IJNetLive. Now I'm going to introduce our guests. We're here with Bruce Shapiro, the Executive Director of the Dart Center for Journalism and Trauma at Columbia University. He's an award-winning reporter on human rights, criminal justice, and politics, and continues to contribute to The Nation and Late Night Live. Bruce also teaches ethics at Columbia Journalism School. He's joined by Sherry Riccardi, PhD, an international journalist and the co-author of ICFJ's Disaster and Crisis Coverage Guide, and an international media trainer who has worked with journalists around the world on conflict reporting, trauma, and safety issues. Sherry is a professor emeritus at Indiana University and a contributor to IJNET. So she's created online courses in media literacy, ethics, and investigative reporting. So hello to you both, and
hello.
welcome.
Hi, Taylor.
All right, so we'll turn it over to you guys then. If Bruce, you want to start with some opening remarks?
Sure. First of all, just how very glad I am to be here. I do, as Taylor said, I direct the Dart Center for Journalism and Trauma, which is a project of Columbia Journalism School, endeavoring to strengthen all of our capacities at covering violence and conflict and crisis and tragedy, both on the craft side and on the sort of self-care and professional collegiality and duty of care side, thinking about both making stronger journalism and stronger journalists for confronting the most challenging issues that we have today. To get the conversation going, I want to lay out a little bit the landscape of trauma and journalism in general, and a little bit about what's particular to our needs as a community in this pandemic. So I'm going to inflict a PowerPoint on you. And please forgive me while I do that. I'm going to run through a few slides as quickly as I can. And then I'll hand it over to Sherry, who will have some specific things to say about reporting on vulnerable people, and then we'll go right away to the conversation. But this is very much about, resilient reporting during this crisis, but also at other times. And I should say that, we're talking about difficult things over the next hour. If in the course of that you find your own history or biography or your own responses triggered at all, that's fine. Pay attention to it. Take care of yourself. Take a few deep breaths, walk away from the computer, do whatever you need to do, but attend to it. I think that's a crucial part of understanding the impact of trauma and self-care. Recognize that we've all got our terrain there, and also keep kind of comforting images in your head. That's the west coast of Ireland. It's a place I was supposed to be this month, and instead I'm talking to you from New Haven, Connecticut. Nowhere near as pretty. So, why are we here? We are in the middle of an unprecedented crisis in which reporting plays a crucial role, both as the carriers of important messages of safety to the public, as institutions of accountability for local and national responses, and as the vehicles for witness. But this pandemic is going to challenge us. It's going to challenge both our craft capacities and our personal capacities, and yet we know we want to stay resilient and effective and relevant during this crisis. This also applies to other kinds of trauma stories, but we're so much in the middle of this now that I think it's important to acknowledge it. I want to talk about what my starting point for this conversation. We are, by definition, trauma-facing professionals as journalists. We witness things directly that sometimes may rattle us profoundly, whether that is crime scenes or wars or earthquakes or anything in between. We have what clinicians would call vicarious traumatic engagements. We are interviewing, photographing, being present with deeply traumatized sources and communities. And our brains don't always distinguish especially well between that sort of vicarious empathetic connection and what we ourselves experience. Likewise, if we are photographers or dealing with user-generated content or are image editors or videographers, we're dealing with a tremendous amount of graphic imagery, more than ever before, because of the open pipeline of social media, user-generated content, police shootings, wars, whatever. Um, a lot of us increasingly deal with external threats and abuse and harassment. Not only those who always have experienced such from the targets of investigative reporting or from authoritarian governments, but through social media and the kind of anti-journalist climate of the time. That's a big issue. We cover events that breach the moral compass, that give a sense that the world is wrong. Mass shootings, a virus in which deaths could have been prevented and are not. That can be rattling. And this accumulates over a career. We all have our capacities that are individual, and this collides with who we are. We bring our own biographies to all of this trauma exposure too. If we're people who've experienced prior trauma as individuals in with gender violence or family violence, if we are part of communities that have been stigmatized or attacked, all of that is part of who we are as reporters, and it can shake you in profound ways. But the good news that I want to make clear from the very beginning is that we must not pathologize ourselves. Every bit of research that's ever been done on journalists and journalism says that we are a resilient tribe. That's my friend Maria Ressa down there, the founder and editor of Rappler in the Philippines, who is the definition of journalistic resilience. She keeps getting arrested and fined and harassed and threatened, and she just keeps going like, yeah, already bunny. The reality is that research shows that while we as a profession have a high degree of trauma exposure, our mission, our craft, our ethics and colleagues are all protective factors. And we have lower PTSD rates than the general population, lower than even some trauma-facing professionals. Our work is protective, and it's important to know that. We're also now dealing with some very different challenges in this pandemic. In the past, when I've talked about covering trauma to journalists, very often we're talking about those big, chaotic, one-time explosive events or ongoing violence. It may be war, it may be family violence, it may be sexual assault. But here we're talking about some different issues, right? We're talking about a long, slow-rolling, fear-producing global wave of pandemic, much of whose results we have not yet seen. We're some weeks away. So first of all of us, just as human beings and our families and communities, are experiencing a lot of anxiety at this moment. And that's a real thing. It's generalized anxiety. And then there are journalism specific anxieties connected to this. Will my news outlet survive? Will I be able to find sources? Even though I'm working in a socially distanced way, will I uh, will I be able to properly verify claims? How do I know which science to follow? How do I make individual stories out of mass experiences? This is a source of real anxiety for us as reporters, and we might as well just name it. It's there. We need to harness it and acknowledge it rather than pretend it's not there. And finally, we're dealing not so much with trauma, the sort of aftermath of sudden violence yet. We're dealing with loss and grief. We have anticipatory loss and anxiety. We wonder who in our life or who among our role models and mentors or cultural figures will still be alive in a month's time. That's a real heavy burden of anticipatory grief. Many of us have had plans for the next several months. My students were expecting to finish their semester, go out and get jobs, all this. I was expecting to be on holiday in Ireland. And all of us are grieving the changes in our plans the loss of sometimes long expected outcomes from work over the next few months. This change in expectations is hard. It's hard for journalists, hard for everybody. All of this is hitting amidst the general wave of stress that is what we ride as journalists. We are all stress surfers, right? We all need deadlines and assignments and changing news landscapes to get ourselves going in the morning, get excited and get engaged. And we all know how to ride that up to a point. And we also know that if the stress is too enduring or too overwhelming, we become exhausted and the surfboard falls off that wave and you end up crashing. You end up with breakdown and burnout. Part of the challenge of this period is going to be to manage the ups and downs of stress when we have the cumulative addition of crisis. So, here's our ordinary lives. We manage normal business, an aggressive editor, the fatigue, the 24-hour news cycle, the stuff that comes in personal life. But if you add to that the isolation of social distancing, perhaps a steady diet of graphic imagery that we're required to look at in our classes, worries about our own personal safety and health in the middle of this, and the exposure to highly distressed subjects, for some of us, that is at some point going to become overwhelming, overtop our personal abilities. So this is a period, and this is true of covering trauma in general, but in particular now when we're dealing with this unusual confluence of stresses and factors, when we need to know our own signs. All the psychologists I've spoken with in the last couple of weeks say it's very important to know, A, we all cope differently. We all sometimes cope well and cope poorly, but we need to know, to think about honestly as journalists, how we cope well with things and how we don't. If you have old bad habits around deadline or substance abuse or smoking, or that's all going to come back during this period of social isolation and anxiety. But you also have good habits, things you're good at, signature strengths. This is the time to reflect on that. And it's also a time to know that if you have personal pre-existing vulnerabilities, whether those are medical diagnoses, psychiatric or psychological diagnoses, or histories of struggles, you need to be thinking about what's worked for you in the past, what's helped you through tough times with your pre-existing vulnerabilities, and put those supports in place. Because I guarantee you that the stress of this period will bring all of those vulnerabilities to the surface. It doesn't mean you shouldn't be reporting if you have a history of depression or if you have an immune suppression or something. You can still be reporting, but know what you need to do to protect yourself. If you're someone who's been in and out of therapy, if that's what you do, go in for a tune-up. If you're someone who is dependent on certain kind of social connections, or if you keep certain medical supplies around, really attend to all of that. And in particular, a lot of us in journalism are warriors. And if you know you're especially someone who frets and ruminates and gets scared, make lists. Think about what you can control and what you can't, and try to focus as a journalist in your work life in particular on those things that you can control. The crucial thing, to go back to that slide I was showing you a couple minutes ago, the crucial thing is that all the neuroscience says that in the presence of protracted stress and extreme stress and threat, what the brain needs more than anything else is recovery time. It needs a time to metabolize difficult information, difficult experiences, lower your physiological arousal so that memory gets consolidated right and doesn't become PTSD, so that you're have the ability to work. So we've been hearing a lot internationally about flattening the pandemic curve. For journalists, we also need to think about flattening the curve of stress in this time, which will greatly flattening the stress curve will greatly enhance our ability to function effectively professionally and our ability to cope well psychologically. A resilient journalist is a well-rested one. You need to sleep, you need downtime. You need to take time in the course of your day, even on crisis days, to do some things that are enjoyable. A few minutes looking at pictures, a few minutes reading a different kind of novel, a few minutes playing music, anything that works. In particular, flatten the curve. You need to plan, and I say plan, don't wait for it to happen. Plan for recovery time. Schedule your day so you have short breaks. Take unexpected breaks. You can go wash your hands, which we all have an excuse to do now. And then when you're done washing your hands, you can put water on your face. You can go for a walk around the block. You can change to a different kind of task, but you need both internal recovery, calming yourself biologically, and external recovery, a change in tasks, a change in atmosphere. Your brain needs that to function. All the research that's been done on journalists says that. And this in particular leads us to our devices. We depend more than ever in this pandemic on our devices, but in the face of trauma, boundaries are crucial. We need to be assertive about boundaries. We need to be owning our devices, not having our devices own us. Get off of them an hour before bedtime so that your brain can calm down. Plan device-free blocks in your day. I am now doing that, which means no little shot of adrenaline from tweets and Facebook. No head exploding at the latest White House press conference. No, nothing. Get away from your devices on schedule. You need boundaries with technology, as does, and we can talk more about this, a self-care plan. There is now 20 years of data saying that journalists who pace themselves, who maintain social connection, and that's crucial, who find ways of lowering arousal, things like yoga or exercise or meditation that lower your biological arousal, also strengthen the brain's ability to properly metabolize. Heightened biological arousal from anxiety is associated with things like PTSD. So you want to lower that arousal. You want to make sure you're getting enough sleep, and that's a challenge on a 24-hour news cycle. Think of it as part of your journalistic toolkit, as much as important as your notepad, as important as your digital accounts. It's crucial. And you need attainable victories, and we'll talk more about that later. You need to be focusing on one or two things in your reporting that you can change. But most important, you want a self-care plan for this period. As long as we're under quarantine, what's my self-care plan? You need to be drafting that. Especially when working remotely. There's actually been research on this. One of my colleagues, Alana Newman, prepared this slide. She's a psychologist. She looked at the literature and said the following things really matter. Getting dressed, okay, before business. All of us are tempted to be in our pajamas, but the reality is people who get dressed seem to work better when they're working at home. Having a schedule. Changing the frustration of this time. Try to convert your thinking about, wow, this is a problem, I can't get to a source, to, oh, this is a challenge, I can't get to a source. That's really important. And this is also a good time to keep a work journal. That is something which I think a lot of psychologists would say is very helpful now, because we get to see our accomplishments at the end of the day. Just a list of what you've done. It doesn't have to be a personal diary. Is a way of gaining some control at a time when we have so little control over a medical situation. And finally, social and collegial support. All the research that's ever been done on trauma and journalists says that the single most important resilience factor, the thing most associated with journalists doing well in the face of trauma, is social connection. The most dangerous thing is isolation. So again, through this period when we are socially distanced and physically distanced, professionally distanced, you want to be asserting yourself. You want to be making plans to see people, scheduling time so that you can learn from one another as we are now, so you can solve problems together, so you can stay connected. It's a crucial, crucial thing. And that's, I think I'll end my piece of this there. That was just an attempt to quickly situate us into the world of trauma and situate us into the very particular situation that we have now.
Yeah, awesome. So Sherry, do you want to make a few opening remarks here before we open it up for questions?
I do. Thanks, Bruce. You made a lot of important points and you provided us with a good overview. I like to thank ICFJ. As Taylor said, timing couldn't be better for this. I would like to thank them for hosting this webinar. People are desperate. Journalists are desperate for information, and this is going to help fill that gap. There's one thing, though, that I know for sure as I listen to Bruce. Journalists are a very stubborn, feisty bunch. We are dedicated to our mission. That's true. We are dedicated to our mission as truth tellers, and we're really willing to sacrifice our own well-being for our jobs. Some say maybe we're too macho, that we show too much pride in what we do, but I would differ with that. I believe that we often care too much, and we put so much of our emotional self into what we do. I have seen this play out in many of the countries where I've worked with journalists. I know we have journalists listening from all over the world today. I've seen it play out in Pakistan and South Sudan and most recently in Ethiopia. During a coup there was a coup attempt, and I happened to be working in the country. And during this time, journalists rushed into the street. Gunfire was still raging, and they were running into the street to cover the story. During one of the training sessions, I asked them, why? Why do you put yourself in this kind of harmful situation? And the response was clear: to get the story. It was important for people to know what was happening. That's what journalists all over the world do all the time. We are first responders. We're just like police officers. We're like firefighters. We're like healthcare workers. And when there's trouble, we rush in. Other people rush away. Journalists rush to the scene. I think that's really an important concept when we talk about taking care of ourselves. Covering tragedy and human suffering is at the heart of what we do. And a lot of what Bruce said addresses that. We're not immune to the emotional impact. It's a matter of figuring out how to deal with it. But Bruce made a really important point that I want to stress. Traumatic stress can be accumulated over a period of time. It doesn't happen just once. It accumulates over a period of time. And if we don't learn how to deal with it, then we become dysfunctional. And that is the last thing we ever want to be. So as part of this webinar, we'll be setting up resources, and we'll talk about that at the end of the webinar. And Taylor has said that those will be posted, so you can figure out how to help yourself. You can look at what's there and say what works for me. Before we turn to the questions, I would like to talk just for 1 minute about the toughest decisions journalists have to make. And that is covering victims and survivors of violence and crisis. How do you interview a mother of a teenage son who's been murdered by a ruthless gang? How do you do that? I recently talked with the Washington Post reporter, Hannah Dreier. She won a Pulitzer Prize last year for her work in covering MS-13, a very brutal gang in New York's Long Island. And I asked her to give us some tips, some best practices on how she worked with the parents, grieving parents of children who had been murdered. And she explained, and I just want to share this with you very quickly, and then we can talk about it later. She said, I tried to let the mothers have control over the interview as much as possible. The first time we talked, I let them tell their story in their own words, at their own pace, knowing I could come back later, giving control to people who are in crisis. And then she said, I found a safe place to interview them and a safe time. At one point, she interviewed a mother at night, and the mother said, wait a minute, I've had nightmares all night long because of our discussion. And she said, fine, we'll only interview during the day. Hannah also explained to always tell why we're asking intimate questions. When you're talking to coronavirus victims or survivors or families who are grieving, it's really important to tell them why we're asking these questions. COVID-19 is the biggest story in the world right now. The courage of journalists all over the world is on display for us. Many of you out there are covering the virus, and I admire so much your courage and how you are doing this very sensitive work. We see reporters in the halls of hospitals. We see them, we see them everywhere. I had a set of self-cares, but Bruce covered it, so I think I'm not going to go over it. I think we'd rather get to your questions, but I just wanted to end by saying, I am so proud of what I see journalists doing with COVID-19 all over the world. I couldn't be prouder of my colleagues. So let's go to the Q&A.
All right, great. So I'm going to start with some some questions that we've gathered from participants ahead of time. So the first one I want to ask, and I think you both started touching on this already, but just to kind of lay it out more clearly for everyone who's listening, is a question that's always kind of been a challenge for journalists, but I think has really been exacerbated and has become so much more difficult as more and more journalists are working from home. Is how do you separate yourself from the work that you're doing to avoid taking on the emotional weight of the subjects you're reporting, and also just to, you know, avoid burning out from constantly being, you know, on. And I think, Bruce, you talk about that with information overload too, when we're constantly being bombarded.
Yeah, well, I guess, so for starters, I would say that with trauma in general, boundaries are a crucial issue, okay? Partly because for ourselves, we need that bit of separation from the work that you're talking about. And secondly, because often our sources are highly vulnerable people. Trauma scrambles people's sense of who they can trust, who they can't. They may rush at you with all kinds of personal information that you didn't need, or may start leaning on you as a friend. And there are ways in which boundaries with the subjects of trauma stories are especially problematic. So seeing this question of professional boundaries as a central challenge in trauma is the first place to begin, knowing that it's front and center, something to attend to as much as accuracy and all of that stuff. How are my boundaries today is a good question to ask. And that gets heightened in this pandemic because we're all of us working at home, many of us with families in close quarters where we can't control a lot of that. So again, you need to be looking at what are ways I can control boundaries. One is in the structure of your engagements with sources and others. Are you planning them? Do you say, we'll talk for an hour? Are you keeping your appointments? Stuff like that is one way. Planning your day, especially if you're working at home, having a schedule is another. Things like building in the yoga or meditation or exercise self-care time is also introducing a different kind of a boundary. The big thing, I think, increasingly that we all struggle with but all need is giving ourselves permission to be off of our devices for fixed amounts of time every day, to be out of the news cycle, to be unreachable. You know, this is not a natural thing for me or for any other journalist. But my wife and I now have a rule: no bedlam before bedtime, right? There's an hour before bed in which there are no devices with screens, interactive devices with screens that we look at. There's stuff we won't put on the TV after 8 o'clock at night. And I now, since this particular crisis began, have been making sure to read only dead tree novels that take you far away at bedtime. You know yourself. All of us know ourselves, but we need to be mindful of those kinds of boundaries and ethical boundaries as well, right? Sexual boundaries with sources and colleagues. All of those things become heightened in the presence of trauma. Boundaries become an ethical commitment, not just a psychological one.
Let me just jump in and say, I've talked about this during training sessions, certainly before COVID-19, but we've talked about it because we've been working more at home, and especially in certain countries where,
Right.
It's just easier. And I think there are three things that stood out to me: is plan ahead for the end of your workday, just as if you were in the newsroom. That's really important. Set a strict time for work hours and stick to it. Unless you've got a story breaking, then it's different. We all snap to attention. And then the second thing is discipline, discipline, discipline. We have to walk away from the computer at the end of the day. I totally agree with Bruce. You've got to have downtime. Walk away from the workspace. Go to another room, or if it's a small apartment, go to another spot in the apartment. Plan something. The third one is plan something enjoyable to look forward to, even at the beginning of your workday. Think about, when I finish today, I'm going to cook a great meal. I'm going to find a movie on Netflix. I'm going to take a walk, whatever it is. The main thing is to walk yourself out of the work mode. And you can do that early in the day. To have something to look forward to, you are more likely to stop. But remember this, taking care of your mind and your body is important. If we burn out, we're no good to anyone. We're certainly no good to ourselves, and we're no good to the public we serve.
Yeah, and let me just say that in this particular crisis, this pandemic, all of the psychologists I've talked to and a lot of journalistic colleagues have a consensus that this isn't so much about, are we all going to get PTSD from this? PTSD exists in journalism, and it's while it afflicts a minority of journalists, it interferes with the specific mechanisms we rely on. So it's important. But the more likely, more common struggle in this crisis is going to be with depression, the impact of protracted stress, and burnout. Those are the things that we think are going to be the more dominant feature. So we need, I gave a slightly different talk than I would have given 2 weeks ago, because we need to be attentive to what Sherry just said. Burnout is the thing that you want to avoid. This story, this crisis, takes a marathon, right? It's not a sprint kind of story. And if we're reporting as if it's a sprint, we're going to hit the wall. And that, by the way, that's also true of most other trauma stories. While there are fast-breaking crises, a mass shooting that you respond to 24/7, or a sudden earthquake or something, and that happens. But we really want to be looking at the long arc of trauma response, of trauma recovery, of community recovery. And that requires us to be present as journalists. And that means we need a self-care plan for the long haul.
And I think there's an added burden. I'll just jump in real quickly before I go to the next question. Just before the webinar, I talked to a colleague of mine. She is a journalist and a healthcare expert. And I asked her what her biggest concerns were. And she said, we're getting a double whammy here. We have to worry about our families. When we go out and cover this story, it's really important. She pointed out journalists have conflicting worries. First, about their own family and whether by doing their jobs, they're putting their families in risk unless they can work totally at home, which some can and some can't. And then she said the second conflict was that getting the information right. Accuracy has never been more important, and it never is more important than when we are dealing with life and death situations, as right now we are. So I thank Melinda Voss for that, because I think her advice is very good.
Yeah. Yeah, I think this is all, great advice. And like I said, these are questions we've been dealing with for a long time, and they've just, they're hitting us differently now in the midst of a crisis like this that's truly global. So I'm going to switch gears here a little bit. This question is from one of our participants, and I'm going to read it directly. I'd like the panelists to discuss the difficulties occurring in civil war-torn countries in Africa and the world. In Somalia, I saw many problems resulting from the civil war, and later when I fled to neighboring countries, I experienced more terrifying issues. In Nairobi, where I live now, I met fellow journalists, and some of them have also had post-war traumas.
Yeah.
So from that, how can journalists cope with the effects of trauma they've experienced through their reporting and through their own lived experiences?
First of all, let me say I'm very proud of that journalist for asking that question.
Yes.
Many journalists don't realize they need help to cope with trauma that they have experienced, both on a professional or personal level. The fact that this journalist is looking for ways to cope, that person is looking for them, shows that they are halfway there. They recognize the need. I have a couple thoughts, and then Bruce can jump in. But part of helping us heal is opening up and sharing our feelings about what it is that we've experienced. And often it's painful, but keeping it inside is like a sore that won't heal. You mentioned fellow journalists who've gone through trauma. It's possible, this person says fellow journalists also have gone through trauma. Is it possible to form an informal group? In Pakistan, there's a very powerful network of press clubs. I don't know if Nairobi has that, but in Pakistan, when they have an issue like that, they start forming small groups and electronically talk to each other. And it's really very liberating for them. Or if they have a media group that will host, having them share a meal, talk out their common experiences. We are sometimes our own best healers with a little help from our friends, which I think is very important. So, and there are many resources like ICFJ and the DART Center that, can help you figure out ways to do this through webinars like this, or webinars you establish in your own countries or in your own communities.
Yeah, I agree with everything Sherry just said. I would add a couple of things to that. First of all, if you are, as a journalist now, struggling with trauma issues, if you're in a country that has a decent public health system, and if that public health system includes psychiatrists and psychologists, trauma, if left untreated, true post-traumatic stress disorder, which alters the way we process memory, alters the way it changes the way we interact with others, may rob us of empathy, can be singularly toxic to journalists. But it's also an area that health professionals have a lot of skill at dealing with. Of all of the big diagnoses in the clinical manual, it's, if left untreated, it's one of the most persistent, but it's also one of the most easily treated with talk therapy in a limited number of sessions. Now, many journalists are in countries where they don't have access to that. There are clinicians around the world who are able to work with journalists via Skype. I would urge you, if you have occupational PTSD, for example, or if you're worried about that and you feel you need to get some help, groups like the Committee to Protect Journalists has an emergency fund that can help pay for stuff like this and help do referrals, help find clinicians. Reporters Committee for Freedom of the Press, Freedom House, others, all the groups that do journalist support are able to do in a limited way a certain amount of referral. So that's something that's important. I would also say that as a professional community, there are things you can do to mitigate some of this trauma impact, including educating yourselves and your colleagues about PTSD and how it affects journalists. There's a lot of resources on the Dart Center website for that. Talking about that, not in a stigmatizing way, but just as, just like we need to know about ethics and we need to know about verifying stuff, we need to know about this. Isolation is the most dangerous thing. So you need to be talking to colleagues about this. It's also important, and this actually applies very much to the current pandemic too. It's helpful in trauma-inducing stories to sit down with colleagues. And if you're a freelancer, that can be just other freelance colleagues or mentors who are in the news business. But it's important to sit down with colleagues at some point and say, what am I doing right on this story or this assignment or in this period? What am I really challenged by? And what can I change in my practice going forward? That simple kind of self-assessment or group assessment is a very powerful tool in gaining a little bit of control. And finally, if you are in sufficient distress, it may be that you need to change the kind of story that you're doing for a while. The great BBC journalist Fergal Keane, who's been a frontline correspondent in many of the countries that you on this call are from, recently announced that he has PTSD and he's going to be stepping back and doing other kinds of journalism for a while he deals with that. There's nothing wrong with giving your brain a break to metabolize difficult periods and use other muscles. It's probably good for you, actually. So.
Yeah, thank you both so much. I think that's a great response to this question. And we got, different forms of that when we were taking questions ahead of time. So I think this is just really helpful feedback. A number of other people have been asking about what newsrooms can do. So I'm going to kind of incorporate a few questions here. First of all, what kind of guidance would you give for newsroom leaders who are looking to set up protocols or programming related to mental health, especially where they, don't have any sort of guidance right now?
Right.
And then, second to that, what would you recommend, especially right now, for newsrooms in terms of making recommendations for their reporters who are dealing with all the challenges related to COVID-19?
I think the reality is few newsrooms I know of in the United States or anywhere else in the world have protocols in place for dealing with mental health. They have protocols in place for safety training and for other kinds of issues, but often nothing about mental health, at least in my experience. We'll see what Bruce
Well,
has to say about that.
yeah,
Um,
well, yeah. Go ahead.
and well, I was going to say that here's what I know for sure. Top managers must buy into the idea, if you're going to have protocols in place for mental health care within the newsroom, you have to bring top managers in, and top managers have to buy into it if it's going to be effective. CNN has done that, BBC has done that, many organizations, and they all tell me the same thing. It's got to come from the top. It can start at the bottom with the journalist, but eventually has to go to the top for them to sign off on it. You can appoint a newsroom committee, which we did in the newspaper where I worked. We appointed a newsroom committee to look into safety issues, mental health issues. You can do research on the resources. You can have your own journalists do the research on the resources that are out there, like ICFJ and DART, and come up with a set of guidelines to present to management about how the journalists want to see it work. And you can engage your fellow journalist in the discussion. Brown bag lunches in the newsroom. Media organizations can set up meetings where you can gather and talk about it. Again, I think Pakistan has handled this through their press clubs. You can find a core group of fellow journalists and mental health experts to work with you. So those are all the things you can do. There is a way to do it, but I have to tell you, top management hasn't expressed a lot of interest yet. We have to get them there. We have to work on them.
I would just add to that, all of which is great. I would add, the good news is that a growing number of news organizations around the world are beginning to wrestle in a more comprehensive way with trauma and mental health.
Mm-hmm.
Some of the big news organizations like the Australian Broadcasting Corporation, Reuters, the BBC have peer trauma support or peer mental health support programs in place where they are actually training colleagues in newsrooms to be kind of informed ears, not counselors, but to be resources for colleagues. That's a model that we know works in other kinds of front-facing professions. There are also examples of journalist grassroots organizations that have adopted formal trained peer support programs. The National Union of Journalists in the Philippines, for example, has one of the very best trauma support programs of any in the world, one that we look at. And they have a group of members who are trained as peer supporters who go through periodic retrainings and like that. So there's that stuff. But I agree with Sherry that this begins, I think of it as a three-legged stool. And ideally, you want a trauma-informed newsroom to have all three legs in place. You want grassroots engagement and leadership with people being peer supporters to another and pushing the issues on management as they can, but having a frank, open discussion of psychological issues that arise. And it's a workplace health issue. You know, you need to stop thinking about this as about feelings. It's no more about feelings than a bullet or a bad office chair is about feelings. It's occupational health, right? So A, where the journalists themselves are pushing it. B, where leaders, where managers are getting some language and some training. And C, where there is, whether it's through HR or through an outside group, there's some kind of counseling or other support in the background. In big industrial societies, that's often the case. It's less often the case for smaller newsrooms. There are tip sheets for news managers on the Dart Center website, and I can make them available to Taylor, who can then send them on after the call. I don't want to spend too much time on that, but I will say that the role of leaders, and not just the top managers, but most crucially the middle managers, the people on the desk, is crucial. There have been studies showing that reporters covering traumatic events who come back to badly managed newsrooms or hostile newsrooms, that greatly accelerates the chance of PTSD. That greatly accelerates the chance of psychological injury. So there's a duty of care. There are skills that middle managers need to learn, and they're not hard, of how to listen, of how to talk about these things, of how not to pathologize, and yet how to be there. It's crucial that middle managers get some of these skills. And also that managers recognize they need to be self-care role models for the rest of the staff. If you're an editor and your team sees you working 24/7 without a break and not taking care of yourself, they're going to take that as a cue for how they should behave, and they're going to burn out. So you have some special responsibilities around things like self-care and boundary management when you're an editor. It affects how everyone else is going to work.
I just want to say something very quickly. And a lot of the training sessions I've done, the journalists really want this, and we'll set up a meeting and I'll say, bring your editors. They don't come. We've had a very hard time getting editors to come. So then they say, okay, you come to our newsroom then. They'll have to talk to you. And I come to the newsroom, and yes, that is a good way to do it. Once you're there with the local journalist, it's really good. We're sitting in his office. There's not much he can do. No, then they do listen, and they do care, and they do respond to the kind of things Bruce is talking about. But it has been a struggle to get them involved, and we just have to keep at it. We really just have to keep at it.
This is a generation-long arc of change all over the world, and all of you on this webinar are part of it, actually.
Yes, absolutely. You're the pioneers, so you're going to make it happen.
So it looks like we have time for, it looks like about one more question. I know there's so many more questions out there, and we'll try and deal with those post-webinar, and all of this will be available, and we'll be sharing resources, so hopefully that'll help too. But this question is kind of about the challenges with opening up and talking about these things. And we started talking about it, of how having difficulties getting newsroom stakeholders into the conversation. But one of our viewers asked, so the problem with opening up and talking about trauma and our own experiences is we fear losing our careers and for future opportunities. So what would you say to someone who's feeling, like opening up would actually harm their career opportunities in the future?
I hear this a lot, particularly from female journalists. I hear it more from the women than I do for the men, that they worry about if they open up, they'll be looked down on, they'll be stereotyped, they won't have the quote macho. But it's a really important question of how they can do it. And again, it goes back to the atmosphere in their newsrooms, what kind of newsroom they have. In South Sudan, it was very hard for the journalists to communicate with management. They simply, they were very separated. And we talked a lot about how do you make it come together. There are very specific ways you can do that. And one is for the journalists to take the initiative. Do you have thoughts on that, Bruce?
Yeah, I think there's a few ways to unpack this. And first of all, I do want to say that not everyone is a talker, and not everyone needs to spill their guts. And that in fact, sometimes, whether it's for cultural reasons, personal reasons, political reasons, whatever, maintaining a sense of boundaries is okay. So no one should take this as meaning that spilling your guts is the only solution, right? There are a lot of different ways to skin this cat. Which is probably a traumatic image in and of itself that I probably shouldn't have used. But I would say this. First of all, if you are on a news team and you're worried about the consequences for your career, you don't have to raise it with the whole team. You might raise it with a trusted colleague offsides, or you might go to a mentor at university, or a mentor in an earlier part of your career who's now in a different organization, to have that conversation if you want to have it. Within a news organization, there's also often a political way to think about it, which is that usually within the management team, and there's 3 or 4 or 5 editors, there's going to be one person who's a little bit smarter and a little bit more sensitive to the situation. You want to cultivate that person as your champion within the leadership group, so that if demands from the floor come up, and if people say, we've been covering narco traffickers for the last 5 years and we're exhausted and we need some help and we need, right? You want to cultivate ahead of time that person who is the more likely champion, so that you've got a defender in place and you're not left to your own devices. When the Dart Center has gone into newsrooms, what we have sometimes found is that it helps to go through sort of a several stage process of engagement where you do a briefing for all the journalists and editors together, a little bit of a separate conversation with the editors, and then they agree on a follow-up, identify a couple of stakeholders, one respected reporter, one respected editor, who then work on the problem together. So you need to, within a news organization, this is typically a political process that isn't going to change overnight. So you need to be strategic as well as dealing with your own emotional needs. It's I'm not going to pretend it's easy, but there have been plenty of examples of huge news organizations and small news organizations changing course, seemingly very dug-in editors who are very traditional, if you can't stand the heat, get out of the kitchen, changing their tunes out of concern for their staff or concern about getting good stories or concern about being sued, right? There's a plethora of motives out there. So I think ultimately the most important fear, though, to face is the censor within, right? While I do think that there are legitimate and important fears about losing an assignment or losing a promotion or getting known as, often, let's be honest, it's also sometimes our own inner assessment that is really holding us back from getting help we may need or enlisting colleagues in a conversation that needs to happen. And there, I think we need to face our own fear a little bit. The history of journalism in the last 20 years is of enormous change when senior respected journalists kind of come out of the closet and say, yeah, this is something I struggle with and we need to talk about it. And around the world, I'm finding that younger journalists now are much more willing to engage in this conversation and have a little bit less of that internal censor. So I would think about that too. And it goes along with the self-care thing, you know?
I just want to mention one thing to the women who are listening. I mean, there are women I know among the hundreds that are listening. Please organize, even informally. Get together with others in your area and talk to them about what can be done about equality in the newsroom. It's very, very difficult for women, not just in countries outside of the US, in the US too. And we found that organizing and speaking with one voice or a couple of voices is much more powerful than all complaining in all our individual newsrooms. So I really, everywhere I go, I say to you, organize yourselves, even informally, speak with one voice, figure out what your issues are and how you can best bring those to the forefront for equality in your newsrooms.
Yeah, that's crucial. I'm seeing, Taylor, we have about 5 minutes left. I would like to, for my closer, give everyone a little exercise that I'd like you all to do privately now. And then Sherry, I think we'll have something she wants to say. But
yeah, that's perfect.
Very much in thinking about these issues of trauma, resilience, this pandemic, self-care, changing the news organization. I would love it if each of you on this webinar would make a short list over the next few minutes of 3 things. One thing I can change in my self-care practice to take care of myself a little bit better. One thing I might change in my journalism practice, how I do my job to address trauma issues. And one thing I could do differently or engage with my news organization, my editors, or my colleagues on. So one thing about self-care, one thing about one change in your professional practice, and one change you could see yourself working with colleagues on within your journalism community, whether that's as within a news organization or a union or as freelancers or whatever. But each of those 3 things, if you make a list of those 3 things, you will have come out of this webinar, I think, with some important takeaways for yourself.
Yeah, and we also just, we talked about this a little bit beforehand, and for anyone who wants to share those things too, I mean, we'll be emailing, surveys afterwards, and we will have a spot for those kind of things. And I think hearing that feedback is really helpful for us. Obviously, no one needs to share. This is a activity that is helpful to you personally. But we'd love if anyone was willing to share with us to hear from everyone who's listening, kind of how this has impacted their day-to-day life through the activity that Bruce has suggested.
Well, it'd be wonderful if we could share, because that, we're helping each other, and in time of crisis like the pandemic, I mean, it's really great to hear all your voices as well as hearing ours today. But I just wanted to close by saying we're going to be posting resources for you from the Committee to Protect Journalists, Poynter Institute, Dart Center, ICFJ, very many of them. So you can look at and compare. And I highly recommend that when you have a few minutes, especially if you're locked down, read through them all and call out, copy what you think is most helpful to you, and then help someone else. Journalists, we need to have each other's backs. Help someone else. I mean, this is the way we survive. It tells me a lot that you're engaged with us because you joined us today. Thank you, thank you, thank you. But please help each other. This is a really important time for us to speak with one voice as journalists as well. Thank you so much. Thank you, ICFJ.
Yes, thank you, ICFJ, and thank you, Taylor, for playing umpire on this.
Yeah. Thank you so much to you both. I mean, I think this was an incredible discussion, and we touched on so many different aspects of mental health considerations. Before, during, after a crisis, like the one we're facing now. And thank you to all the participants, and echoing what, Bruce and Sherry have said, like, you've already taken one step by being here listening to us, and recognizing that these topics are important, even in the midst of, the craziness of your everyday work. So thank you so much for tuning in to everyone who's listening. As we said before, your feedback is critical, so we will be sending a survey after this. And like Sherry said, we'd love to hear kind of what you're changing in your life so that we can amplify that to others. And finally, so we'll be sharing a recording of this on YouTube, and we'll be posting about that on IJNET. And we'll also have our recap resources. And we have a number of stuff for everyone who's dealing with COVID-19 reporting on our site as well. And that's everything from this mental health discussion to, all the other things that come along with that. So thank you, Bruce and Sherry. Thank you to everyone.
Stay safe, everybody.
Thank you,
Stay safe.
Yeah, stay safe. Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.